Her son left her at the airport like forgotten luggage. By the time he reached his bank, she'd already frozen every account. He thought he controlled. The card declined, the mortgage bounced, and the mother he once used like an ATM was now teaching other women how to vanish. He left her stranded. She left him bankrupt. Wait, before we go any further, I got to ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. When the plane's wheels kissed the runway and the seatbelt signs blinked off, Margaret's heart lifted, ready to see her son waiting with smiling arms open. Instead, she stepped into a terminal thick with strangers and cold, fluorescent light. No smile, no familiar voice calling Mom. Only the sharp kiss of winter air sliding through the automatic doors, and somewhere inside her chest, something old and hopeful cracked quietly apart. He wasn't coming. Margaret tightened her grip on her small suitcase, her wedding band glinting briefly under the harsh airport lights. She stood near the passenger pickup area, shifting from foot to foot, pretending at first that maybe traffic had delayed him, maybe there had been a mistake, a crossed wire. She pulled out her phone, thumb hovering over Adam's number. No new texts, no missed calls. She called once. It rang 4 times before dumping her straight into voicemail. His recorded voice suddenly sounded hollow, too young, too far away. "Hey, it's Adam. Leave a message." She didn't. Instead, she lowered her phone, pocketed it, and inhaled deeply, the scent of exhaust fumes and burnt coffee filling her lungs. For a long, trembling moment, she stood there under the slow swirl of evening snow, waiting for something, anything. But airports are brutal places for hope. It took her exactly 7 minutes to realize she hadn't been delayed. She had been discarded. The cab driver barely glanced at her as she slid into the back seat, her suitcase thumping softly against the door. "Where to, ma'am?" he asked, voice rough with long hours. "Home," she said quietly, giving the address she hadn't changed in 30 years, the address Adam had memorized when he was 5 years old, the one he hadn't bothered to drive to today. The cab merged into traffic, headlights slicing through the snowy dark. Margaret stared out the window, her hands resting in her lap, knuckles pale. The city blurred past, holiday lights blinking cheerfully in windows, couples huddled close under umbrellas, shops throwing their last sales before Christmas, all of it rushed by, indifferent. Her phone buzzed once, a text not from Adam, a marketing alert. "Miss you. Ready for your next vacation?" Margaret let out a short, bitter laugh. She pulled up her banking app instead. Her thumb hesitated over the screen, a single button glowing beneath Adam's smiling face, still set as her account's emergency contact. Emergency, a funny word. She thought an emergency was supposed to mean something urgent, something worth dropping everything for, something worth showing up for, not something you forgot at baggage claim. She tapped into the account management settings. Joint access, Adam Andrews, secondary debit card authorized under Adam Andrews, beneficiary clause listed under Adam Andrews. It wasn't money he had earned, it was loyalty he had assumed. Margaret felt a strange calm settle over her, like stepping into a hot bath after a lifetime spent cold. She scrolled down to the control panel, freeze access. A simple button, no alarms, no drama, just quiet. The cab hit a pothole, jolting her slightly. Outside, the city was already beginning to frost over, the sidewalks emptying, the wind picking up a mournful hum between buildings. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She pressed her thumb to the screen. Freeze account. Confirm. Yes. The screen blinked once, twice, and then a new banner appeared. Access suspended. Pending authorization renewal. Margaret slid the phone into her purse. She leaned her head back against the cracked vinyl seat, the chill of the window seeping into her hair. For the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for Adam, and for the first time in years, he would have to find out what it meant to be left out in the cold. Outside, the traffic slowed near her block. The cab driver muttered something about road closures ahead. Margaret barely heard him. She was already planning the next step because freezing one account wasn't the end. It was just the opening move. Some revolutions happen with gunfire and banners. Some happen in the backseat of a cab with one silent woman staring into the rainy dark. Margaret didn't plan it. She didn't write speeches or draft revenge lists. She just decided quietly, finally, that loyalty deserved better than betrayal, and in that moment, everything changed. The cab's heater sputtered weakly, filling the car with a lukewarm hum as it crept through the frozen city streets. Margaret leaned her forehead lightly against the glass, the condensation misting at every breath. Beyond the window, headlights blurred into ghostly streaks, and Christmas decorations blinked in tired surrender. She wasn't thinking about the airport anymore. She was thinking about 30 years of blind loyalty. After her husband died too young, too fast, Margaret had tightened her entire world around Adam. Every parent-teacher conference, every scraped knee, every broken heart, she had been there, the invisible net always catching him. When Adam had his first big idea at 23, a startup app nobody even understood, Margaret hadn't hesitated. She cashed out part of her early retirement fund, smiling through the banker's warnings. "He's a dreamer," she'd said. "Dreamers need wings." She never told Adam what it cost her, how she skipped buying a second car, how she stretched meals, how she stayed at a job she hated for 5 extra years. And when the app failed, when the investors pulled out, when Adam came home slumped and hollow-eyed, she simply hugged him tighter and said, "We'll find another way." The cab pulled onto her quiet street. The old brick row houses leaned tiredly against one another, dusted with snow. The snow lay like half-forgotten relics from another time. The porch light she'd left on shone weakly against the dark. The cab driver cleared his throat. "Here you go, ma'am." Margaret handed him the fare, her hands steady, her voice calm. "Keep the change." She stepped out into the freezing air, her breath puffing like smoke, and pulled her small suitcase up the cracked steps to her front door. Home, at least the skeleton of it. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cinnamon and old paper. Family photos lined the mantel. Adam's gap-toothed grin at 6 years old, his high school graduation, his wedding day. Trophies gathered dust on shelves, Little League championships, debate medals, certificates Margaret had framed with pride. None of it mattered now, not the frames, not the sacrifices tucked behind every smiling picture. She dropped her suitcase by the door and moved toward her study with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. Her laptop hummed to life, bathing the room in cool blue light. Margaret logged into her banking portal. The familiar home screen blinked up, lists of accounts and balances, ones Adam had assumed would always be there waiting to catch him. She clicked on emergency access. Adam's name appeared, tied to every critical branch, a lifeline he hadn't earned but always counted on. Margaret hesitated for just a breath, then with fingers steady as stone, she selected Remove Authorized User. A confirmation box appeared. "Are you sure this action is permanent?" She clicked yes without flinching. The screen refreshed. Adam's name vanished like a leaf carried away on a silent tide. But Margaret didn't stop there. Her mind moved faster now, sharper. She opened a second window. A small legal firm's website blinked up, one she had researched late at night for months, just in case. She filled out the intake form with precise, careful clicks. Establish new trust account. Sole beneficiary Margaret Andrews. No successor trustees, unless personally appointed. By the time she closed the browser, her hands weren't trembling. They were steady, sure, free. Her phone buzzed on the table, a single, simple text from the firm. Confirmation. Trust established under only your name. Margaret leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking softly beneath her, and stared at the dark window. Somewhere across the city, Adam lived under the illusion that her loyalty was still a leash he could tug at will. But tonight, Margaret had slipped the collar. Tonight, She had begun the slow, silent journey back to herself. And when Adam reached for her next, he would find nothing there but empty air. Some prisons don't have locks or chains. They're stitched together with invisible threads: guilt, obligation, old promises. Margaret hadn't realized how many threads Adam had tied around her life. She only realized how light she could feel once she started cutting them one by one, and not a single apology was needed. Morning light bled through the dusty blinds as Margaret stirred awake. Her body was stiff, but her mind startlingly clear. The quiet of her house felt heavier somehow, but not oppressive, more like space she was finally allowed to inhabit without guilt pressing against her ribs. Today wasn't a day for errands or emergency wire transfers or unexpected favors wrapped in sweet-voiced manipulation. Today was hers, and today she planned to finish what she had started. In the back seat of that cab, sitting at her small kitchen table, she pulled out her laptop again. The screen blinked to life, cold and familiar. She navigated to her credit accounts with a precision that came only from years of quiet management, paying bills for Adam he barely remembered asking for, covering shortfalls he promised were temporary. Her eyes landed on a familiar secondary cardholder Adam Andrews, monthly use $2,000 to $5,000, paid automatically, quietly. Margaret's lips thinned. No ceremony this time, no hesitation. She clicked Cancel Secondary Card and watched as the system processed the request. In seconds, the thread snapped, gone. Her phone buzzed barely an hour later. Adam, Mom, your account's glitching again. Card's not working. Can you check? Margaret stared at the message. No, hi, Mom, no, how are you? Just an assumption that her world should revolve around smoothing his. For a heartbeat, her thumb hovered over the keyboard. Old instincts itched to offer to help, to apologize for inconveniencing him. Then she remembered sitting in a hospital bed 5 years ago, post-surgery, waiting for Adam to visit, waiting 5 days. He never came. Work emergency, he'd said later, breezily laughing over the phone. Margaret put the phone down without replying. No anger, no sadness, just the quiet decision that silence sometimes speaks louder than explanations. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out her folder of personal documents, medical directives, living will, emergency contacts, all the things she had carefully prepared over the years with Adam's name scribbled dutifully across them. Another invisible chain, another false anchor. That afternoon, Margaret sat at her old oak desk, the winter light slanting in, golden and soft across the worn wood. With calm hands, she updated every document: emergency contact removed, medical proxy new appointee, a trusted friend from her church group. Beneficiary now a combination of charities and independent causes close to her heart. She signed the new forms with a final flourishing stroke. It was the first time her name stood alone since she had been 22, and it felt right. That night, Margaret climbed into bed earlier than usual. Her joints ached slightly in the cold, but her spirit was curiously warm. The house was so silent it hummed like the deep, peaceful breathing of something finally at rest. No half-dreams about unpaid bills, no sudden 3 a.m. texts, no adrenaline spikes wondering what new emergency would demand her peace tomorrow. For the first time in decades, she slept deeply not because she was exhausted, but because she was free. Somewhere across town, however, freedom was feeling a little different. At exactly 11:34 p.m., Adam posted a status online in a casual, half-joking tone, but Margaret knew the scent of panic when it crept into words. Anyone know a good loan officer? Life happens. The words hung there, public and desperate, like laundry strung up in a storm. The invisible threads were snapping all around him, and he hadn't even realized yet that the worst cuts were still coming. There's a special kind of pain in realizing you weren't forgotten by accident. You were erased deliberately, cleanly, like you never mattered at all. Margaret didn't expect balloons or cards, but watching the party unfold without her, streamed in perfect HD, was a clarity she hadn't braced for. They celebrated everything she once built and never once glanced at the architect. The flicker of blue light from her laptop screen bathed the darkened living room in a ghostly glow. Margaret sat stiffly on the edge of her worn couch, hands folded neatly in her lap, watching the live stream buffer into focus. Confetti rained down across a glittering hotel ballroom where Tina's birthday bash roared to life. Gold balloons bounced against chandeliers, and waiters in crisp black uniforms circulated trays of champagne and cupcakes stacked like towers. There was Adam, front and center, arm around Tina's waist, grinning wide for the camera. Margaret stared at the scene, a tightness pulling behind her ribs, not quite sorrow, something harder, sharper, recognition. She had spent decades making birthdays magical, late nights handcrafting dinosaur-shaped cakes for Adam when he was 6, buying cheap plastic crowns for his pirate-themed party at 9, sacrificing her only weekend off at 42 to host his surprise 21st birthday when none of his friends stepped up. There had been no live streams back then, no diamond jewelry, just flour-dusted aprons, burnt fingertips, smiles stitched together through exhaustion. Margaret rubbed the back of her hand absent-mindedly, remembering the small scar she still carried from the time she scalded herself trying to fix a broken birthday candle holder at the last minute. On the screen, Tina unwrapped a tiny velvet box. A gasp of delight followed, diamond earrings gleaming, perfect, catching the light just so as Tina twirled for the camera. The comments poured in, OMG, #husbandgoals. She's so lucky. You guys are such a dream team. Margaret tilted her head slightly. She knew the box, recognized the logo printed in silver script. It was from an upscale jeweler she once helped Adam finance after his second business failed. Just a small favor, Mom. I swear I'll pay you back next month. He never did, but Tina wore the payoff now, dangling proudly from her ears, a glittering reward built from Margaret's sacrifice. The camera panned across the room, laughing faces, dancing bodies, flashes of wealth bought on someone else's back. Not once, not even once, did Adam glance down at his phone. No guilty texts, no missed calls, no invitation accidentally lost. She wasn't forgotten. She was irrelevant. Margaret sat back, her hands steady as she closed the laptop lid. The room plunged into darkness, except for the faint golden halo of the lamp across the room. The house hummed quietly, the heater clicking on, the old walls settling. Margaret didn't cry. She smiled, a small, dangerous thing, not of sadness, but of strategy. She moved slowly, methodically, to her desk and opened her laptop again, not for live streams this time, but for something far more permanent. She logged into her private banking portal, the one Adam didn't know existed. The cursor blinked on a screen that offered quiet power, open new international account. Margaret filled in the fields with clinical precision, name, secure ID, private offshore location. Her assets would no longer sit within Adam's grasp, even if he woke up tomorrow desperate to claw them back. The final screen popped up, confirm transfer. She clicked yes, hearing the soft chime of success. The money began to flow, slow, silent, unstoppable, just like her. Across town, Tina's laughter shrieked through party speakers. Across her own living room, Margaret's world finally went silent in the best way possible. She wasn't just cutting ties anymore, she was cutting oxygen. And by the time Adam realized it, it would be far too late. It wasn't the moment Adam's card declined that truly shattered him. It was what followed, the creeping realization that the life he'd leaned on was no longer his to access. Some losses are loud, others unfold in quiet humiliations, a beep at a register, a bank's polite but deadly tone. The supermarket's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as Adam juggled 2 armfuls of groceries onto the conveyor belt. Tina had texted him a long, passive-aggressive shopping list that morning: organic milk, imported cheeses, gluten-free crackers she didn't even like but thought looked classy. Adam barely glanced at the prices. He never had to, that's what Margaret was for, or so he thought. The cashier, a teenager with a bored expression and chipped purple nail polish, scanned the last item and announced the total, $246.89. Adam swiped his debit card casually. The machine beeped. Transaction declined. He frowned and tried again. Declined. A few people in line shifted uncomfortably behind him. Someone coughed pointedly. Could you run it again? Adam muttered, voice low, face heating. The cashier shrugged and pushed the card through manually. Declined. Maybe call your bank, she offered, tone clipped. Adam forced a laugh, leaving the cart where it was and backing away from the growing pile of groceries. Outside in the parking lot, the winter air slapped him clean across the face. He yanked out his phone and called the bank, fingers trembling slightly. A few agonizing minutes on hold later, a syrupy voice finally came through. Hello, Mr. Andrews. I'm seeing a freeze placed on the linked account. It's pending verification of primary ownership. Adam's stomach dropped. Pending verification? What are you talking about? That's my mother's account. I have access. I'm sorry, sir, the voice said, all fake sweetness. Our system. Your authorization has been revoked. All secondary users are frozen pending review. Adam stared at the steering wheel, feeling it pulse beneath his sweaty palms. He wanted to yell, to threaten, to demand, but deep down a gnawing truth twisted inside him. He was nobody. Legally, financially, he was nothing. Meanwhile, across town, Margaret sat in a sun-drenched office lined with law books and soft rugs. Her estate lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Miss Carter, slid a thick folder across the mahogany desk. All finalized, she said crisply. Every asset moved, every account secured. Your legacy is now protected, fully independent of any external claim. Margaret nodded, the weight of years lifting from her shoulders like a discarded winter coat. She picked up the pen without ceremony, and with a steady hand, she signed the final page. Effective immediately, all independent control. Somewhere in a supermarket parking lot, Adam's panic was morphing into rage. He called Tina. She picked up mid-scroll through social media, irritation already crackling in her voice. What's your problem now? My card declined. Adam hissed. Mom froze everything. Tina scoffed. I told you not to rely on her forever. She's old, Adam. She doesn't know what she's doing. She does, he snapped. She planned this. Silence crackled on the line, and for the first time, Adam heard it in Tina's voice, the thinly veiled contempt. You need to get control back, she said venomously, before she squanders everything. Adam's jaw clenched so hard it hurt. Control. The word rattled around his brain like a loose screw. In the lawyer's office, Margaret leaned back, feeling the sunlight warm her face through the wide windows. For the first time in decades, her future wasn't being dragged behind someone else's sinking ship. She had steered herself free. She had done it silently, and she was just getting started. At that moment, Adam sat slumped in his car, watching the empty balance on his banking app, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't know it yet, but the woman he had once seen as a safety net had cut every last thread, and the fall would be harder and lonelier than he could ever imagine. Dreams built on borrowed foundations don't collapse overnight. They rot slowly until one morning you wake up in the wreckage, wondering who moved the ground beneath you. Adam didn't realize yet. He still thought Margaret's silence was temporary. He still thought she was waiting for him to fix it. He hadn't learned yet that she wasn't waiting at all. The first real fracture came on a gray Tuesday morning, hidden inside a plain white envelope. Adam tore open the letter with lazy indifference, thinking it was another credit card offer. Instead, the bank logo stared up at him, sharp and unfriendly. Notice of mortgage payment failure. Account status, delinquent. Immediate action required. His stomach twisted. Must be a mistake, he muttered, flipping through the pages with shaking hands. But deep down, Even before calling the bank, he knew the automatic payments, the ones Margaret had always quietly arranged, had stopped. The safety net was gone. The slam of the front door rattled the hallway as Tina stormed in, dropping her designer shopping bags with a sharp thud. "Explain this," she snapped, thrusting the letter into Adam's face. He tried to laugh it off. "Bank glitch. Mom will fix it. She always does." But even as the words left his mouth, they sounded hollow. Tina crossed her arms, her voice a low hiss. "You better fix it, or we're finished looking like fools in this neighborhood." She didn't wait for a response, just stormed upstairs, heels hammering each step like gunfire. Across town, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, a cup of warm chamomile tea steaming between her hands. She hadn't opened any of Adam's desperate text messages. She hadn't answered his calls. Silence had become her shield and her sword. She had spent too many years filling the gaps Adam left behind, patching holes he ripped open, financing dreams he never respected. Flashback: Margaret outside Adam's college dorm room, holding back tears as she helped pack his things after he flunked out freshman year. No anger, no lectures, just silent support, writing another tuition check while Adam promised, "Next time will be different." It never was. Another job lost, another failed startup, another sudden emergency she was expected to absorb without thanks. Now Adam's world was crumbling, and Margaret wasn't racing to rescue him. She folded her hands calmly over her tea, listening to the peace she had bought for herself, sip by sip. Outside, a sparrow chirped on the windowsill, oblivious to the chaos unraveling miles away. Inside, Margaret's laptop buzzed with another alert, this one from Facebook. Curious, she clicked it open. Tina had posted a cryptic message: "Some people only support you when it's convenient. Some parents forget their responsibilities." Sad. Dozens of likes, pitying comments from strangers. Margaret smiled faintly. Let them think what they wanted. She owed no one her story, especially not those who had edited her out of theirs. With deliberate slowness, Margaret opened a new tab. Travel websites blinked to life. White sand beaches, turquoise waters, luxury spas promising peace beyond imagination. She scrolled carefully, savoring every glowing description. No guilt, no second thoughts. She selected a 5-star oceanfront spa resort known for its seclusion and healing retreats. She booked a full package: private villa, daily massages, sunset cruises, zero contact with the outside world. Payment: private offshore account, no one else's approval needed, no one else's permission required. As the confirmation email chimed in her inbox, Margaret sat back, feeling the kind of satisfaction that wasn't loud or showy. It was the deep, molten kind that filled her bones and whispered, "You did it. You chose you." Meanwhile, at the house Adam once thought was his forever, another envelope slid through the mail slot. This one stamped, "Final notice" in bold red letters. But Margaret would never see it. This time, she wouldn't be the one bailing him out. Freedom doesn't arrive like a marching band. It comes quietly, sometimes in the shape of a plane ticket, a suitcase, and a heart finally too tired to wait for apologies. Margaret didn't look back when the plane lifted from the tarmac. She didn't even glance down at the crumbling world she'd left behind. Some places you don't escape from, some places you rise above. The resort emerged like a mirage out of the blue-green waters, white villas scattered along a stretch of untouched coastline, the ocean sparkling like crushed diamonds under the sun. Margaret stepped off the boat, the warm boards of the dock creaking under her sensible sandals. The air here smelled of salt and freedom. A young staffer in linen pants and a sun-bleached polo offered her a chilled glass of lemonade. "Welcome to Coral Bay Sanctuary," he said, smiling. Margaret smiled back, feeling the heat kiss her cheeks and the weight lift off her shoulders in slow, sweet degrees. Her villa overlooked the sea, perched high enough that the morning waves whispered against the rocks like secret lullabies. Inside, Everything was soft neutrals and flowing fabrics, white curtains that danced on the ocean breeze, cool tile floors, a bed big enough for dreams she hadn't dared have in years. She dropped her suitcase by the door, kicked off her shoes, and padded barefoot onto the balcony. Below her, the water shifted and shimmered with every breath of the wind. Margaret took a deep inhale. This was hers, not rented, not borrowed, not sacrificed for anyone else's emergency. That night, she opened a brand new leather-bound journal. The first crisp page stared back at her, blank and brimming with possibility. She uncapped her pen and, in neat, deliberate strokes, wrote her first entry. "Today I belong only to myself." She underlined it twice. The ink barely had time to dry before a knock sounded at her villa door. On the porch stood a woman in her early 70s, short silver hair, a mischievous smile, tan skin weathered like well-loved leather. "Hope I'm not intruding," she said, holding up a bottle of wine like a peace offering. "New arrivals stick together around here. Name's Eleanor." Margaret laughed, a real bubbling laugh she hadn't heard from herself in years. "Come in," she said warmly. They drank wine on the balcony, swapping quiet stories of lost husbands, selfish children, and the joys of finding new lives when nobody thought you would. By midnight, Eleanor had convinced Margaret to sign up for morning sailing lessons and poker nights too, Eleanor added with a wink. Nothing says freedom like bluffing a retired CEO out of his resort tokens. The next few days slid by like warm honey, mornings learning to sail, afternoons spent at the spa, evenings laughing around bonfires with other women who had all survived something. Margaret bloomed in the salt air. Every day she grew lighter, stronger, more certain that choosing herself hadn't been abandonment, it had been survival. Back home, Adam's world shrank with every ignored call. He tried once, twice, 6 times, voicemails stacking up like junk mail, each one angrier than the last. Margaret watched the screen flash his name once and calmly swiped block contact. No drama, no shouting, just peace. But some people don't go down quietly. The warning came 2 days later via an email forwarded from her lawyer, Ms. Carter. Subject line: Notice of intended legal action. Tina's name gleamed nastily in the signature. The email was a mess, half threats, half demands, all soaked in desperation. Claims that Margaret was mentally unfit, that she had been coerced into freezing accounts, that Tina and Adam deserved access for her own good. Margaret closed the email without blinking. She poured herself a second glass of wine, feeling the ocean breeze curl into her hair like a blessing. They could scream into the void all they wanted. She wasn't listening anymore. Tomorrow, Eleanor had promised to take her to a secret beach where the water was so clear you could see your own reflections smiling back. Margaret planned to swim out as far as she could and leave the last shards of guilt behind in the foam. Words can wound deeper than any knife, especially when they're written in legal ink. Adam and Tina thought Margaret would crumble under pressure. They forgot paper cuts bleed too. Margaret had spent a lifetime learning how to bleed quietly and survive. Now she wasn't bleeding anymore. She was carving lines they dared not cross. The sun was high over the resort when Margaret's phone buzzed softly on the balcony table. Not a call, not a desperate voicemail, an email. Subject: Cease and desist confirmation filed successfully. Margaret sipped her fresh pineapple juice, smiling slightly at the clean finality of those words. The lawyer, Ms. Carter, had been thorough. The letter sent to Adam and Tina laid out every boundary in cold, clinical language: no direct or indirect harassment, no unauthorized financial access attempts, no false public claims of guardianship, abandonment, or elder exploitation. Violation meant automatic escalation to court proceedings. Margaret hadn't needed to raise her voice. She had simply raised the stakes. Meanwhile, across town, Adam ripped the envelope open with shaking hands. The paper trembled in his grip as Tina read over his shoulder, her face flushing dark red. "You can't be serious," Tina hissed. "She's threatening us?" Adam crumpled the letter, slamming it onto the counter. "This is your fault," he snarled. "You pushed too hard." Tina's eyes narrowed. "She started it, thinking she could cut us off after everything we did for her." Neither said aloud the one truth pulsing between them. They hadn't done anything for Margaret. They had only taken, and now the bill was coming due. Margaret, however, was miles away emotionally and soon geographically. That afternoon, in the cool marble lobby of the resort, she signed the final papers on her second condo purchase, a cozy, sun-drenched unit in a small coastal town overseas. Investment property, yes, but also a second safe harbor freedom. Had a price, and Margaret had paid it in full. She tucked the paperwork neatly into her new travel folder, the edges crisp, untouched by greedy fingers. As she sipped a cappuccino under the shade of a palm tree, a memory floated back. Young Margaret, barely 30, standing outside a travel agency window, staring at glossy posters of Greece, Italy, the Maldives, dreaming of trips she'd never taken. Always putting off adventure for one more year, one more responsibility, one more emergency Adam couldn't handle alone. She had promised herself back then, someday. Someday had finally arrived, and no one, not guilt, not blood, not obligation, was going to steal it again. Later that evening, Margaret met Eleanor at the outdoor lounge for sunset cocktails. Eleanor leaned in, mischievous as ever. "News travels fast in small towns, darling," she said. "Apparently, someone back home is making quite the scene." Margaret raised an eyebrow. Eleanor slid her phone across the table. A public Facebook post blared across the screen. Elderly mother abandoned by greedy lawyers. Family shut out by heartless manipulation. Tina's name sat proudly at the top, dripping in fake concern. Margaret chuckled softly. "They're playing the sympathy card," she said. "Let them," Eleanor replied, clinking her glass against Margaret's. "You control your story now, remember?" Margaret leaned back in her chair, letting the sunset pour molten gold across her face. She wouldn't engage, she wouldn't stoop. She would build her life so loudly their lies would sound like whispers by comparison. Tomorrow she would sail again. Tomorrow she would swim under stars so bright they erased old scars. Tonight she would savor the quiet victory of a life finally lived on her own terms, and somewhere across the world, Tina's desperate posts would sink into the vast, uncaring ocean of noise, barely a ripple against the tide. Margaret was now riding a wave. Some battles aren't fought in courtrooms. They're fought in comment threads and blurry screenshots, fueled by anger and half-truths. Tina and Adam thought they could win by shouting louder. Margaret didn't raise her voice. She raised her evidence. And when the dust settled, only one story would still be standing. The post exploded faster than a lit match tossed into dry grass. Within hours of Tina's furious Facebook rant, shares, comments, and emojis flooded across screens like a tidal wave. Poor mother. How could kids treat their own blood like this? Selfish, disgusting strangers who had never met Margaret called her names, painted her a villain in a tragedy she didn't even write. Some posted links to donation pages, others offered prayers wrapped in judgment. The internet's jury had convened, and they hadn't even asked Margaret to testify. Margaret scrolled through the posts slowly, her face unreadable. Eleanor leaned over her shoulder, shaking her head. "They're building a bonfire," she said, "without realizing you're the one holding the matches." Margaret set her phone down carefully. "No," she said softly. "I'm just holding the truth." Back home, Adam couldn't help but smirk as he watched the attention balloon. "Public sympathy," he said smugly. "Sipping cheap whiskey. Always works." Tina lounged nearby, phone in hand, liking every comment that painted them as victims. They thought they were winning. They didn't know Margaret had already started her quiet counterattack. Margaret hadn't come to the resort unarmed. Long before she ever booked her escape, she had begun gathering her own arsenal, bank statements showing every unauthorized withdrawal Adam had made, voicemails where he casually joked about bleeding mom dry before she even noticed. Text messages from Tina threatening to make her pay if Margaret didn't hand over control, legal documents confirming her sole ownership of all her assets, and the crown jewel, a voice recording secretly captured by Eleanor's cousin, who happened to overhear Adam ranting at a local bar. "Old Bat should have just rolled over and given us what we deserved. She owes us. Without her money, we're screwed." The audio quality was perfect. The entitlement dripped from every word, proof, real, cold, undeniable proof. Still, Margaret didn't strike immediately. She let the smear campaign burn itself out, patiently collecting every comment, every post, every shred of fabricated drama like dry tinder stacked for a future fire. Every screenshot dated, every lie carefully archived. Eleanor marveled at her restraint. "Why not hit them now?" she asked one afternoon as they watched the sun melt into the ocean. Margaret sipped her tea, the golden light catching the quiet steel in her eyes. "Let them dig their own grave deeper," she said. "The fall hurts more when you don't see it coming." Then, on an otherwise perfect Thursday morning, as Margaret lounged by the infinity pool, a resort staffer approached with an apologetic smile. "Ms. Andrews, a courier arrived for you. Official documents." Margaret accepted the envelope without flinching. Inside, in flowery legalese, was her latest insult: notice of pending lawsuit, allegations of elder neglect and financial incompetence filed by Adam and Tina, filed under lies, filed under desperation. Margaret let the paper flutter onto the poolside table. She picked up her drink, the condensation cooling her fingertips, and she smiled. Because what Adam and Tina had just handed her wasn't a weapon against her, it was a weapon against themselves. They had made it official now, and Margaret was ready to meet them not in the court of public opinion, but in a real court where evidence, not sympathy, won the war. They expected her to tremble in front of the judge, to weep, to stammer, to collapse under the weight of their rehearsed performance. But Margaret didn't come to court with tears. She came with documentation. She didn't raise her voice. She raised her receipts. The courtroom smelled faintly of floor polish and desperation. Margaret walked in wearing a slate gray pantsuit, soft pearls around her neck. Her neck and the same calm expression she'd worn at her husband's funeral, a mix of dignity and detachment that unnerved the unprepared. Adam and Tina sat at the opposite table, flanked by a young, nervous-looking attorney flipping frantically through a pile of color-coded folders. Tina wore all black, dramatic and strategic, her mascara already smudged in anticipation of sympathy. Adam couldn't meet Margaret's eyes, not yet. The judge, a woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked hair and no time for theatrics, adjusted her glasses as she scanned the docket. "Case 143, Andrews versus Andrews," she read aloud. "Allegations of elder neglect, financial incompetence, and undue influence. Plaintiff, you may begin." Adam's lawyer stood, his voice quivering as he launched into a shaky monologue about generational confusion, family breakdown, and a vulnerable woman who had clearly been taken advantage of by manipulative third parties. Margaret didn't flinch. She waited silently like a fuse. When it was her turn, her lawyer, Ms. Carter, rose with quiet confidence and opened a single manila folder. "Your Honor," she said smoothly, "my client has no need to speculate or dramatize. We offer only proof." She placed 3 neatly stacked binders on the bench, one for the judge, one for the opposing counsel, and one she opened in front of the room, flipping to the first page with a satisfying snap. Exhibit A, text messages from Mr. Adam Andrews requesting funds under false pretenses. The next page, Exhibit B, bank statements showing thousands transferred from Margaret's account to cover their rent, car payments, and personal luxuries, none of which she authorized. Long-term flip, Exhibit C, a voicemail dated 2 months before this lawsuit, Mr. Andrews clearly stating, and I quote, "She's losing it. Once we get control, we're set for life." The courtroom went still. Even the judge arched an eyebrow. Tina paled. Adam shifted in his chair like the air had turned poisonous. Margaret just sat still, her hands folded, her silence louder than any defense they could have given. The judge spoke at last. "Plaintiffs, would you like to respond?" Adam stood. "Your Honor, my mom has always needed help. She just doesn't realize it. We were only trying to protect her." Margaret finally looked up. Her voice, when it came, was soft, measured, unshakable. "I raised my son alone after my husband died. I funded his first 3 businesses. I paid off his credit cards, his mortgage, and his wedding. I missed my own retirement to make sure he never went without." She paused. "But I never once gave him permission to treat me like an ATM with a pulse." A few gasps rose from the benches. The judge leaned back, absorbing the words like a blow. "I may be old," Margaret continued, "but I am not broken. I did not forget who I was. They did." The ruling came swift and clear, all claims dismissed. Plaintiffs are fined for filing a frivolous suit. This court recognizes Margaret Andrews as legally, mentally, and financially competent in full. Tina's mouth fell open. Adam dropped into his seat, face flushed. Margaret stood and nodded once at the judge. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She just walked out, shoulders straight, heels steady on the tile floor, as if the weight of years had finally lifted from her spine. Outside, a journalist was already waiting. "Ms. Andrews, is it true your son left you stranded at an airport?" Margaret paused only briefly, then she slid on her sunglasses and replied, "That's not where he left me. That's where I left him." By the next morning, the headline was everywhere. "Mother left stranded at airport wins lawsuit against son for financial exploitation." The comments flooded in supportive, furious, inspired. Some shared their own stories. Others simply wrote, "Good for her." Finally, a parent who fought back. Margaret read the headline once, then she folded the paper, placed it on the table beside her morning tea, and watched the waves roll in through the open window. She didn't need applause. She had her freedom, and it sounded like the ocean. They thought they were living on her money, but Margaret knew better. They were living on her silence. When the silence ended, so did everything else. You don't feel a roof vanishing all at once. You feel it leak, creak, collapse. The tow truck didn't arrive with drama. It hummed quietly down the cul-de-sac like it belonged there. Adam watched from the front porch, arms folded, jaw clenched, as the driver climbed out and made no eye contact. The man moved with muscle memory, like Adam was just another name on a long, exhausting list. "You can't just take it," Adam barked, stepping forward. The man handed him a clipboard without looking up. "Missed 3 payments, bank's orders." Nothing personal, but it was personal. Everything felt personal now. Later that same afternoon, the foreclosure notice appeared like a slap on the front door, bright yellow, and taped so firmly it tore the paint when Adam yanked it off. Tina saw it first. Her face turned to stone. "I told you she'd never let this go," she snapped, pacing the living room like a caged animal. "You couldn't even convince her to settle." Adam ran both hands through his hair, already thinning from weeks of stress. "She's cut off everything I've tried, calls, emails, even an apology letter." Tina's laugh was short and sharp. Too little, too late. 2 days later, she was gone, packed her bags, took her cosmetics, her designer heels, and the last shred of their broken facade. Her parting words were a whisper behind a slammed door. "I married you for stability, Adam, and now you can't even keep the lights on." Across the world, Margaret's morning was filled with a different kind of silence, one filled with peace, not punishment. She stood by the balcony of her new beach condo, sipping dark roast coffee from a handmade ceramic mug. The air smelled of salt and citrus, and her skin carried the kiss of sun that no courtroom, no confrontation had managed to burn away. She scrolled through her inbox, deleting spam and promotional junk without a second glance until one subject line made her pause. Her pause, visa renewal confirmation approved. Her smile came slow and steady, no place to rush, no permission to beg, No strings attached, just a stamped confirmation she was free to stay or go on her terms. Later that evening, she met Eleanor and Miss Carter, her lawyer turned friend, at a small tapas bar tucked along the waterfront. They toasted to choices made late but right. In between laughter and sea breeze, Miss Carter leaned in and handed Margaret a brochure. "From the Department of Aging," she said. "They're launching financial literacy workshops for seniors next quarter. Someone suggested your name." Margaret blinked at the title, "Take Back the Ledger, Teaching Women to Guard What They Built." She traced the embossed lettering with her finger. "Why me?" Miss Carter smiled. "Because most people wait for permission. You rewrote the rules." Margaret folded the brochure and tucked it into her purse. "I'll think about it," she said, but a small fire was already catching in her chest. The idea of showing others how to cut invisible chains, how to defend themselves quietly, how to stop saying yes when the cost was everything. They were back in the States. Adam sat alone in a darkened living room, scrolling through news articles. He used to mock articles about financial abuse, about consequences, about how quickly the world forgets you when you run out of people to exploit. Every click echoed like a door slamming shut, every empty voicemail a reminder she wasn't coming back. They tried to take her money, her voice, her identity, but Margaret had something they couldn't steal, experience sharpened by betrayal, wounds that had healed into wisdom. And now she wasn't guarding her legacy, she was building it, one woman at a time. The room wasn't large, just a sunlit space in the back of a local library in a coastal town where tourists came for the views and stayed for the quiet. But to Margaret, the folding chairs filled with silver-haired women felt more powerful than any courtroom, more sacred than any resort balcony. She stood at the front behind a humble wooden podium, her voice steady as she read from the first page of her notes. "Your name belongs on your own bank account. Your signature belongs on your freedom, and your story belongs to you, not to the people who edited you out of theirs." Silence followed, then soft murmurs, then heads nodding. Then one woman whispered, "Finally." It had started with a single call. A friend of Eleanor's at the Department of Aging had reached out after reading the court headline. They didn't want Margaret for pity. They wanted her because she had done what most women never felt allowed to do. She had said no. She had stopped apologizing for surviving. Now, every Wednesday, Margaret hosted the Freedom and Finance Circle for women over 60, many of them widows, mothers, caretakers who had spent decades placing others first. She didn't lecture, she shared. She told them about the time she cashed out her pension early because Adam's startup needed just a little push, about how she'd gone years without buying herself a new coat because the kids needed help, about how guilt had worn her thinner than grief ever could. And then she told them how she stopped. The first seminar ended with a standing ovation. One woman sobbed openly and hugged her. Another whispered, "I thought I was alone." Margaret looked around the room. Not as a victim, but as a spark. Each woman walked out with a printed booklet, how to read a trust agreement, how to revoke power of attorney, how to say no in a world that made them feel guilty for even thinking it. She didn't just want to protect herself anymore, she wanted to build armor for others. Later that evening, Margaret sat on her balcony, a soft breeze brushing through her short-cropped silver hair. A mug of tea cooled in her hands, untouched. She pulled out her legal folder, now weathered from weeks of edits. Inside was her revised will. She had added a new clause that day, one that left 70% of her assets to a rotating group of women's shelters and legal aid nonprofits for senior citizens. Her lawyer had asked once, "No share for your son?" Margaret had simply replied, "I already gave him more than I had." She signed the new draft quietly, no ceremony, no regret. The pen glided across the line like it had been waiting years. Flashback: Margaret sitting in the dark of her kitchen at age 48, wondering how to stretch a grocery bill because Adam had borrowed again. Margaret standing outside a car dealership with a co-signed loan form in her hand, the salesman asking, "You sure about this?" Margaret at 62, watching her birthday cake burn down to wax because no one showed up. Each moment had been its own tiny death, but now every signature, every workshop, every woman she helped was resurrection. The next morning, she checked her mail out of habit. Mixed among the usual spa coupons and property management letters was a plain white envelope, no return address. She opened it slowly, the paper stiff and awkward in her hands. Inside was a letter in messy handwriting, a single sentence, "I need you, Mom." Signed Adam. No demands, no explanations, just 6 hollow words heavy with history. She read it once, then again, then folded it neatly. She didn't cry, she didn't answer. She simply placed it inside her journal next to a clipped headline, "Local Woman Transforms Betrayal into Community Empowerment." The envelope didn't scream for attention. No threats, no begging, just a quiet plea on cheap paper. But inside, it wasn't a son asking for help. It was a man trying to escape the consequences of who he'd become. And Margaret, she had finally stopped cleaning up other people's messes. The envelope sat unopened on her kitchen counter for 3 days. Margaret walked past it each morning, the sound of the waves through her open window drowning out any curiosity it tried to stir. She made her tea, she attended her finance workshops, she laughed with Eleanor over fresh oysters and wine. But on the 4th evening, as the sky turned a molten lavender, her hands were steady with knowing. She slid the envelope open. The handwriting was sloppier than she remembered, rushed and uneven, as if written in the back seat of desperation. "Mom, I'm in trouble. Not just financial, legal. I didn't know things had gone this far. I never meant to." The words blurred for a moment as Margaret's eyes hovered over them. "There's an investigation for fraud. They're saying jail time. I don't know what to do. I need your help, please. I need you." "No, dear Mom, no. I'm sorry." Just panic poured into ink. Her jaw tightened. There was a time she would have sold her wedding ring to save him, but that time had come and gone and been buried beneath court filings and burned bridges. She folded the letter, pressed it flat, and slid it into a manila envelope. Then she attached a post-it with a single sentence, "Relevant material regarding ongoing fraudulent activity." Source: unsolicited letter. No signature, no emotion, just the truth finally used in the right direction. She sealed the envelope, addressed it to the Financial Crimes Investigation Bureau, and dropped it into the outgoing mail slot before the sun rose the next morning. No drama, no guilt, no hesitation. 2 weeks passed in quiet rhythm, workshops, walks, seagulls, laughter. The letter faded from her thoughts, folded somewhere between memory and closure, until one evening as she washed dishes with a playlist humming softly in the background, Eleanor burst through her door. "Turn on the TV," she said, breathless. Margaret dried her hands, turned to the screen, and flicked it on. Local news headline flashing across the bottom: "Son of recent court case, plaintiff arrested in multi-state fraud scheme." And then his face, Adam, in a mugshot shot, his expression dazed, hollow, defeated. She didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She just stood there, the sponge in her hand dripping slowly into the sink. The anchor's voice continued. "Adam Andrews, 38, was taken into custody this afternoon following a months-long investigation into check fraud and fraudulent financial filings tied to frozen joint accounts and misappropriated emergency funds." Eleanor placed a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder. "You okay?" Margaret nodded once. Yes, and she meant it. Flashback. The day Adam was born, how small he looked wrapped in blue hospital blankets, how she had whispered to him, "I'll protect you from everything." But some battles, she learned, weren't hers to fight, especially not when he became the danger. That night she journaled one line: "I opened his letter, then I closed the chapter." In the morning, she brewed her strongest coffee, stepped out onto the balcony, and let the sea wind lift the ends of her robe. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't mourning either. It was a different kind of peace, the kind that only comes when you stop rescuing people who don't want to be saved. She picked up the remote and turned the TV off. The screen went black, but the story, hers, was just beginning. The news fades to commercial. Margaret turns away from the screen and toward a future where her name is finally her own. The tide didn't ask what she carried. It just kept coming, wave after wave, pulling away what didn't belong. Regret, guilt, a lifetime of whispered apologies she'd never gotten. And Margaret finally let go. The sun was still low on the horizon when Margaret stepped onto the beach barefoot, the sand cool and damp between her toes. She hadn't slept much, but she hadn't needed to. For the first time in decades, her mind didn't race to anyone else's needs, no lists, no voicemail reminders, no buried panic that someone might need something she hadn't planned for. Today was hers, her 70th birthday, and she'd invited no one but the ocean. The wind teased the hem of her linen dress as she walked slow and steady, each step pressing a quiet rhythm into the earth. She passed families setting up umbrellas, joggers with headphones, children chasing foamy waves, but no one stopped her, no one recognized her, and she didn't need them to. She carried a smooth stone in her palm, small, gray, faintly warm from her grip. Etched into its surface was a single word, closure. A gift from Eleanor, wrapped in nothing but a nod and a hug and a whispered, "It's time." She reached the waterline just as a stronger wave rolled in, kissing her ankles, the salt stinging a small cut she hadn't noticed. The pain was mild, cleansing. She exhaled. "This is where it ends," she whispered, "and where I begin." Then, with no grand gesture, she drew her arm back and tossed the stone. It arced once, twice, and disappeared into the sea. She didn't watch for the splash. She just closed her eyes, let the breeze rush over her, and smiled. Flashback, Margaret at 32, holding a baby Adam, whispering promises she'd break for the sake of his future. Margaret at 54, signing over her savings for his third business idea. Margaret at 60, eating alone on her birthday while Tina posted beach selfies. Now those versions of her felt like characters in someone else's life. The woman standing on this sand wasn't desperate. She wasn't owed. She wasn't waiting. She was free. Back in her condo, sunlight poured through the balcony doors like warm syrup over polished wood. A vase of tulips waited on the kitchen counter, her own gift to herself. She brewed a strong espresso, humming to herself as the machine hissed and sputtered. A thin envelope waited on the floor beneath the front door. She hadn't noticed it earlier. She picked it up, turning it over, no stamp, no return address. Inside, a short letter printed on embossed resort stationery. "Miss Andrews, we're pleased to offer you a permanent residency suite at our coastal property tailored for independent long-term guests seeking tranquility and beauty. Based on your loyalty and contributions to our local community, we believe you'd be a perfect fit should you choose to accept. Consider this your official invitation to make this paradise your home." There was no sales pitch, no pressure, just an open door. She sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from her cup. The letter laid neatly. Beside it, the same ocean she'd walked that morning glittered just beyond the glass. Some people spent their lives chasing retirement like it was a finish line. Margaret had learned the truth. Retirement wasn't the end. It was the rewrite, and hers was just beginning. Margaret folds the letter, places it next to her passport, and whispers to herself, "Let's see what forever looks like." The day he left her at the airport, he thought it was a delay, a misunderstanding, a mistake she'd forgive. But Margaret knew better. That gate never reopened because some departures don't wait for apologies, they wait for rebirth. The residency contract sat in front of her, printed on thick ivory paper, the ink sharp and deliberate like every decision that led her here. A soft breeze moved through the balcony doors, brushing against the sheer curtains, bringing with it the faint scent of sea salt and plumeria blossoms. Margaret held the pen between her fingers, paused, then signed her name slowly, every letter steady, every loop and curve defiant in its calm. Her signature hadn't always meant ownership. Once it had meant permission, surrender, sacrifice. Now it was her final declaration: I choose me. After the ink dried, she walked into her living room where her suitcase, an old leather one with a broken zipper she'd never fixed, rested against the wall beside a framed photo. It was the photo she'd taken with Eleanor's help just a few weeks ago, her standing outside the arrivals terminal of the airport where Adam had once abandoned her, hair windblown, suitcase in hand, eyes shining with something fierce and irreversible. She had written the caption herself, "The day I chose myself." She placed it on a small table by the entrance of her new apartment, facing the front door, a reminder to every version of herself that walked in or out. The days before her move were quiet but not hollow. She donated her furniture to a shelter for displaced elderly women. She handed out handwritten notes to the staff at the local cafe and library, each one saying, "Thank you for letting her be just another face, not a headline." She sat by the ocean on her final evening and watched as children played in the shallows, laughter echoing across the waves like wind chimes. She didn't think about Adam, not his voice, not his mugshot, not the last letter he'd sent her. She had already buried that grief, and, unlike before, she didn't carry what she buried. Flashback: Margaret, 25, holding her baby on a second-hand couch, whispering, "I'll give you everything." Margaret, 47, paying his rent, behind on her own bills. Margaret, 60, left behind at an airport curb with nothing but silence and cold wind. Present: Margaret, 70, walking barefoot into the future with a signed contract, an open passport, and nothing she didn't choose to keep. At the bank earlier that morning, she'd closed her last U.S. account. The teller had smiled politely and asked, "Reason for closing?" Margaret didn't blink. "Because I'm done." People who never saw me, she'd said it without venom, just truth. She didn't owe rage anymore, only peace. She paused before boarding the ferry that would take her to the island where her new residence waited. A soft vibration buzzed in her purse. She glanced at the screen. Adam again. Blocked again. She didn't even open the message. The voiceover would play in the final scene like this: "Love without respect is slavery, and I loved too long without being seen. But now I answer to no one. He left me stranded. I left him bankrupt in every way that mattered." Margaret stepped onto the ferry, the sun at her back, suitcase rolling behind her. She didn't look back. The wind lifted her scarf like a flag, not one of surrender, but one of survival. And then she disappeared over the water, not as someone who was left behind, but someone who finally